Hi, Professor Marshall. Hi, YouTube. Here is my YouTube project for the Living Writers class. Today we're going to talk about poetry as a form of narrative. Welcome. Um, just so you don't think that I'm some disembodied voice, my name is Danielle. I'm a first year fiction MFA at San Diego State, and I was inspired to tackle this concept because I have so many friends who are super literary, majorly voracious readers, and I keep hearing time and time again, I love to read, but I don't really like poetry or I don't get poetry. And I said I was a fiction MFA, but one of my really big writing mentors was a poet, or is a poet. And she really instilled in me a love of poetry that even kind of bleeds into prose. I love um, prose writers with super lyrical voices and who kind of infuse music and tenets of poetry into their prose. And I really look at poetry as just another outlet, another sort of entry into um, the idea of narrative and story. And I'd like to show you how. So humans are hardwired for stories. I have a friend who runs a literary nonprofit and tells a story that if you've ever cornered a hapless soul after a tough week with it over a drink in a bar, then you have a story to tell, whether you consider yourself a writer or not. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, I think viewing poetry in this way can help make it accessible. Sometimes poetry is sort of seen as distant and difficult, riddled with images and symbolism and words, collections of words that mean things that maybe aren't clear to the naked eye. And um, I don't think it necessarily has to be that way. Um, one of the one of the two examples that I'd like to talk about um, in this video are um, number one, Blood Histories by Tara Stillions Whitehead. If you're a Living Writers fan, just as an aside, um, the recording of Whitehead of Whitehead um, reading from the semester is available on this YouTube channel. So I encourage you all to check that out. Blood Histories was a really beautiful example of a form of hybrid poetry. And with hybrid poetry, sort of the lines of traditional or conventional like poetry and prose kind of become um, not muddied, but just sort of blurred over because a lot of hybrid writers tend to break away from the traditional forms of either one of either camp and tend to use a lot more of what most writers and literary people would call prose poetry. So they're almost poems written in like paragraphs that are through like poetic lines. Whitehead with this collection explores themes of addiction and trauma and trauma can be an interesting thing to kind of process and unpack with either hybrid poetry or narrative poetry as a whole, because sometimes sometimes that's hard, right? And sometimes people go through things that maybe they don't have the language or the wherewithal to kind of process through on a level that would work for a traditional novel or a traditional memoir, but they can sort of use poetry as a tool to kind of process the more of the raw emotion, raw and core emotion behind an experience um, versus having to like flesh it out completely like one would in an essay or a memoir or a short story. Another example I would like to share is Pinata Theory by Ellen Cesaro. This is a poetry collection which, um, unlike Whitehead's Blood History that we just talked about, this is more defined in more, contains a more traditional poetic form. There's a cento, which is a 100-line poem, and there's another um, poetic form called the sestina, which is like 4-line um, stanzas, and sestina plays with the repetition in a different way. And Cesaro explores themes of class and cultural identity, including them. Wrapping up, so what do you think? Do you have any other ways of how to make poetry accessible to masses? Um, as a writer, I said I have a soft spot for poetry, and I think it can really inspire people to sort of get into other sort of literary forms, other literary genres, and be sort of the thing, maybe be the thing that unlocks the desire to write or the desire to, or the need to process difficult emotions. Um, but that's a video for another time. So thanks for listening to me. Um, mm, have a great day, y'all.